So today, as we continue our study through the minor prophets, we are going to Obadiah. And again, these are not in chronological order in the Bible, but Obadiah is said to probably be one of the first minor prophets. So that could be important. And we'll recap all that kind of in the end, okay? But as I'm studying this and reading through it again, I was reminded of times in current history that truly represent this book. Even today, culture represents this book. But I was reminded back when Osama bin Laden was killed. And we watched many Americans stand in the streets on the videos celebrating, cheering, right? And it seemed fitting, since the same thing, exact same happened when 9/11 happened, and all these other nations were cheering about the destruction on American soil, right? And I remember feeling at that time torn. Like, how do I celebrate? What am I supposed to feel as a Christian at this moment? Thankful that a murdering terrorist had been defeated, but in my heart, I just could not say, I'm so glad they murdered him. I'm so glad he's dead, right? Any more than I thought it was appropriate for other nations to rejoice over the deaths at 9/11 or other tragedies that have happened on American soil, right? So this book put a lot of stuff into perspective for me based on that. What if God genuinely looked down on both times of celebrations in these histories, or even the celebrations that we see now occurring and happening, right? That's a question I've been really pondering while researching this talk about Obadiah. So with that set in mind, let's talk about Obadiah. So again, nothing is really known about this prophet per se. Where he came from, his parents, his histories, all seem to be a mystery. There are actually 13 Obadiahs that are mentioned in the Old Testament, and scholars are not united at all on if one of them actually refers to this important message by this Obadiah. So I'm not going to speculate either. I'm not going to spend time doing that. But the book of Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament. If you read ahead, that was the fastest read you've had to do, right? But does not shortchange us on an extremely important message that we still need to hear about today. And in some ways, it's an extension of last week's or the week before of Amos. So scholars place his ministry and his message between 586 and 553 BC, writing his book in 585 as a response to the Babylonian invasion. Okay. This book is different than a lot of the other minor prophets because he's not addressing the nation of Israel, either one. But rather, his prophetic message is for the Edomites, a neighboring nation of Israel. So, Obadiah's assignment to deliver a stark warning to this nation, this enemy nation that God has noticed and will deal with the wrong that they have done. So who are the Edomites? Edomites. Many of you may already know this, but the people of Edom were actually descendants of Abraham. Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah had twin boys named Jacob and Esau. The short book of Obadiah is a culmination of a long-standing feud between Jacob and Esau. Okay, so let's do a brief history, important reminder. Esau was one of the twin brothers. He was the older, he was more outdoorsy. Jacob was considered, not by scholars, but we consider him more of a mama's boy, right? Esau, being the oldest by minutes, had earned the rights to the majority of his father's wealth, as well as a parental blessing, and to become the patriarch of the family when Isaac passed away. But Jacob tricked Esau. After all, his name means deceiver, right? By convincing Esau, who was famished after a hard day's work, to sell his birthright all for a bowl of soup, right? So that's kind of where the juxt of it. I mean, they argued in the womb, but that was a real clincher for Esau, right? In a moment of fleshly desire and desperation, Esau compromised a very sacred thing. We could do a whole message on that, but we're not going to. He compromised for immediate gratification. Something valuable was lost for his temporary gain, right? So after this, when Isaac was dying, Jacob deceived his father, convincing him that he was Esau, dressing himself in the hair and all that, and received the prayer blessing that was supposed to be meant for Esau, and then became the patriarch of the family when Isaac passed. So fuel was added to the fire constantly of the sibling rivalry that began in the womb and would carry on for nearly a lifetime, because Esau ate what they considered the soup that he ate was like this red lentil soup that Jacob offered him to curb his hunger in exchange for his birthright. Esau was given the nickname Edom. Edom means red. So it was a taunting reminder of what he gave up for the rest of his life. So Esau ended up spending nearly a lifetime trying to hunt Jacob down for his revenge. Jacob later, as we know, has an encounter with God. And after this encounter, God changes his name from deceiver to Israel, which means governed by God. Okay, so Jacob's descendants are the Israelites. Esau's descendants are the Edomites. Make sense? So this sibling rivalry was passed down from generation to generation, especially within the Edomite people. Eventually, Jacob and Esau will make amends. Again, this is a very nutshell version of the story. But by then, the poison of hatred and disdain could not be reversed in the nations that had been built. There are constant stories of Edom refusing to come to the aid of Israelites through the years. And it's all from the sibling rivalry. So the culture that Obadiah faced, Obadiah sees a vision from God that paints the Edomites in an extremely prideful and boastful way. So verses 1 through 9 announce a warning for their pride. And verse 1 says, a battle will come against you, Edom. Verse 2, behold, I will make you small among nations. You shall be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Okay, so there's a lot of geographical information in this that is not just it's literal. It's not just a figurative speaking, because the geographical location of the Edomites was really, truly high up on the rocks. Some scholars say it's what we know of as Petra, in the rocky, higher elevations, right? They were nearly impossible to penetrate because of their surrounding area and where they were raised up. So they trusted their fortress that made them unreachable by enemies. Their enemies knew that, so as a result, they made many treaties with their enemies. And because of their position with their enemies, it allowed them to control key trade routes, allowing them to become extremely wealthy. They were by numbers very small, but they were very powerful in stature as far as their geographical location and their wealth as well. But what was the biggest of them was their heads, was their pride that they gained from all of that. So the Edomites believed they were superior to the Israelites. They were arrogant beyond belief. Esau was superior to Jacob. However, the descendants of Esau didn't consider Israel was truly governed by God. He never accepted that change for God, in God's eyes, for Jacob, from deceiver to being governed by God, right? And in verse 7, Obadiah delivers a realization to the Edomites that says, all your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set up a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. So in other words, you have no idea that your enemies you've made alliances with are pulling the wool over your eyes at all times. And your pride has made you ignorant to this reality. So one scholar writes this about that. Pride is very deceitful and it's very deceptive. It makes us think things about ourselves and others that simply aren't true. The Edomites were not the last people deceived by pride. They thought that their alliances made them strong, and they were proud because of that strength, but it was a false reality. However, after years of denying the Israelites, like we talked about, and attacking them and giving them up to their enemies, the Edomites made one final prideful and revengeful move. And that's the focus of Obadiah today. When Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 556 BC, once again, the nation of Edom revealed that their pride and arrogance and heart of revenge had kept them cold to the people of God. So verses 11 through 14 reveals the ultimate allegations as a result of their pride, but not before verse 10, where God reveals why their punishment due to their pride is going to be more severe. Verse 10, because of the violence done to your brother, Jacob, shame shall cover you and you shall be cut off forever. So one scholar offers this food for thought. Some sins become worse depending on whom we sin against. It is sin to treat someone else badly. It is worse to treat a brother or sister in Jesus badly. It is a sin to speak harshly to anyone. It is worse to speak harshly to your husband or wife. I think that's interesting food that we can think of and contemplate and chew on, right? Because God made that evident right here. So I know Jesus died for all and all sins are equal in the Father's eyes. However, does the way we treat certain people grieve the heart of God more? Something to contemplate. But Obadiah goes on to make 4 accusations against the Edomites that were committed against their brothers. And all of these, I believe, offer good lessons for us today. Number 1, they refused to help a brother in need. Verse 11, on the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lot for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. So in other words, when Babylonian nation invaded, attacked, and took captives from Jerusalem, you, Edom, stood by and did nothing. And that makes you just as evil as the Babylonians who overtook your own family. The Edomites were on the sidelines basically watching and saying, sucks to be you, right? So God called the nation of Israel their brothers. We cannot miss that. That was God's choice of word for them. But in the eyes of the Edomites, the Israelites were enemies. And they treated them as such. So we have to ask ourselves, who do we consider an enemy that God may be saying that is actually your brother? How often do we remain silent when someone is being attacked rather than standing up and doing something about it? We've studied James early on, but James 14 says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. We cannot sit idly by when others are suffering. Jesus goes as far to say, love your enemies. How good are we really at doing that? And then one scholar wrote, sometimes doing nothing is a great sin, because Numbers 32:23 speaks of that kind of sin. It says that kind of sin will find you out. And the sin it speaks of is the sin of doing nothing. If you do a deep dive into that, that's what God is saying in there. Is it somebody else's responsibility or is it our own? But worse than just watching the devastation of Israel unfold, number 2, they rejoiced over the destruction of their brother. Number 12, but do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. So pride at any level in our hearts can lead to all sorts of ungodly feelings. Jealousy, envy, and even a sense of joy when someone we don't agree with suffers. How often have you said it? I know I've said it. They had it coming. Because they made their decisions, they had it coming. Or they made their bed, now they can sleep in it, right? Especially when it's someone who has done us wrong. We're like, yeah, I have no sympathy. No sympathy for you. And this is actually how much of our culture acts today. That sympathetic, empathetic nature seems to have all but disappeared. And why? Because of pride. We saw this hateful attitude when Charlie Kirk was killed. People celebrated it, and it was sick. And this is where I also struggle with Osama bin Laden celebrations. Am I any better by celebrating that when I didn't agree with them celebrating Charlie Kirk? I celebrated the act of defense, but I just couldn't in my heart celebrate that he was murdered. It's not that I didn't believe something needed to happen, but I should not get joy from it any more than the liberals often got rejoicing joy over Charlie Kirk. In fact, Proverbs 24:17-18 clearly instructs us. It says this: do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles, lest the Lord see it and be displeased, and then turn his anger away from him. So you see the mind-boggling dilemma that creates for us. I am not to rejoice because God says he will withdraw his anger from them if I rejoice. But do I still rejoice by not rejoicing in the beginning because God says they're going to get it in the end? Do I still rejoice that, well, it's coming? Do you see the dilemma in our hearts? Because our hearts are truly wicked. We have to have a heart check at all times. God says, do not rejoice at all, not even in the end. So how do we get to that place that the love of God is so present in our hearts and minds that not even for a moment do we rejoice over the suffering of even the worst of our enemies? It's the word we talk about all the time, and it's one we have to do constantly, and that's surrender. A surrendering of our heart, an acknowledgement of our heart, acknowledgement of our thoughts, and then a surrendering of that, as a constant surrender and acknowledgement that without the saving grace of Jesus, we would look just like them. Because our righteousness is not our own. It's the righteousness that covers us by Jesus Christ. So if we stand up and have any ounce of pride, we are doing that on our own self-righteousness, not Christ's righteousness. But the Edomites took it even further than refusing to help and rejoicing over the Israelites. Downfall. Number 3, they ransacked Jerusalem when they were down. Verse 13 says, do not enter the gate of my people in their day of calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. So their high and mighty pride not only caused them to sit idly by while Babylon conquered Jerusalem, not only led them to rejoicing over it, but it also led them to participate in their suffering, taking advantage of them in their vulnerable state. So they go behind the Babylonians and steal and loot from their cousins, their family, by helping themselves to their wealth that was left behind by the Babylonians. Now, I have to stop here and pause and say, I don't think anyone here in this room is that kind of person, right? But again, as I've said many times, pride is a sin, and sin unchecked grows to these places that we think we would never go. It's a prideful thought to say, I would never do that. We're going to talk about that again in a minute. But Edomites refused to check their hearts at this point, or at any point, and they helped themselves to the goods that remained. But even worse yet, number 4, they went a step further and they joined in the violence against God's people. Verse 14, do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. So the final progression of Edom's sin was worst of all. They were so hard-hearted against God's people that they joined the attack against the very people personally. So when Edomite people encounter the people of Judah fleeing from the attacking army, they either cut them off, which means they killed them, or they gave them over to Babylonian army as prisoners. There was no grace, no mercy, no sympathy. One scholar says this: sin proceeds by degrees. Neither is any man at his worst at first. Again, we may not get to the point where we are guilty of the last two or the three or whatever, but no one is at their worst when this seed of sin or pride begins to grow. Again, unchecked pride, unchecked jealousy, unchecked greed, unchecked hatred, unchecked resentment, unchecked disdain will take us to places we never thought we would go. And it isn't just about self-reflection, but allowing others to speak into your life when they see it in you as well. In our minds, we can justify our thoughts and actions. We know what's been done to us. But when confronted with truth from a fellow believer that we are acting in sin or our thoughts are sinful, we better listen. The core of my being, personally, many of you have heard me say this, I deal with envy. It is my deadly sin. We all have our deadly sin. Each one of us has something that motivates us away from God in our human nature. And for me, it's envy. More than anything else in my life, I battle it constantly. And I sure hope any of you, especially those closest to me, would be courageous enough to say, man, you're sounding really jealous today in your statements about that person. You're sounding really envious. Like, are you loving that person in your mind right now? I want to be called out. This is why we have to admit our sins to each other and build a community that doesn't want to see any other person progress in their sin, the degree to degree to degree that it does, or excuse the sin and confront it. Verse 15 acts as a bridge, linking the first part of the book to the second part of the book. Verse 15 says, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, Edom, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head." So Obadiah shifts from Edom to all nations as he is announcing the day of the Lord, as many of the minor prophets do, right? Saying all prideful nations that act like Edom will face the justice of God in the same way that Edom will, falling from their prideful heights and coming to ruin as it is expressed in verse 18. I think we can correlate to that as a personal person equally as a nation, right? So we need to have that warning in our hearts and minds. Verse 18, "The house of Jacob shall be fire and the house of Joseph a flame. As a result, the house of Esau will be stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau. For the Lord has spoken." So Obadiah is sent to use Edom as an example of how one day God will confront the pride of all nations leading to their fall. Sadly enough, this warning is not heeded by the Edomites because they continue to despise the Israelites, even up to the point of the birth of Jesus. Because when Jesus was born, it was King Herod who, remember, tried to have Jesus killed. He says he wants to, he leads them astray by saying, "I want to worship this baby. Show me where he is." But secretly, they knew he wanted to annihilate Jesus as a baby. So he ordered all boys under 2 to be slaughtered in Bethlehem and all of its surrounding areas. Now, we know Jesus had already fled to Egypt, so Jesus was safe. But imagine the devastating emotions that ensued. Because of this insecure, vindictive, murderous man, many were slaughtered. How does that relate to Obadiah? Because Herod was an Edomite. It carried on that long. This rivalry continued even through the Christmas story. This is approximately 1,500 years after Obadiah's warning to the birth of Jesus, where Herod is acting out as a hateful Edomite. So their hatred only grew stronger over the years. However, true to his word, the house of Esau, the Edomites would be destroyed. But ironically, it would be while actually coming to the aid of the Israelites. In the time of the first century church, when the Romans began to lay siege on Jerusalem and all the Jews, at this time, for whatever reason, the Edomites decided, well, we know what reason, because it was God's ordaining, hand in it. But for whatever reason known to us, the Edomites decided it was time to help their brothers. But as the saying goes, too little, too late. Approximately at this time in first century, when Jerusalem was being attacked and overcome by the Roman soldiers, approximately 20,000 Edomites were encircled by Romans as they came to the aid of Jerusalem. And in 70 AD, they were all burned in the fire that Jerusalem encountered at the temple. It says every last Edomite was killed there, just as Obadiah predicted. We know a lot of this, not just from biblical stuff, but from Jewish historians like Josephus, if you've ever heard of him. He's a first century historian who carried out a lot of the details that we don't know biblically in the Bible, but were recorded at the time of the awful invasion of Rome on Jerusalem. But as always, God's judgment is always preceded by warnings. They were warned of this. They did not heed the warnings. But just like Joel and Amos, God used Obadiah to paint a picture of what will come at the day of the Lord as well. Beyond their own nation, but to the end of all nations, right? So the final 3 verses of Obadiah offer a very hopeful future where God restores his kingdom and will repopulate it with a faithful remnant of God's people. So he ends on this high note. But at the time, he didn't foresee the future where that warning was played out exactly as God had him deliver it. The Edomites seem to have their day against God's people, but at the very end, the kingdom shall be God's, and he will have his way against them. And he did. And that's the warning that we have for the end times as well. All of these point to the day of the Lord, the final day of the Lord, where he will take care of his people in an awesome way. So Edom's rise and fall reflects how God's justice will one day oppose the pride and violence of all nations. May we not be in that category, personally, or as a nation, as a body of Christ. But one scholar wrote this. He said, Obadiah wasn't remembered for his life. We don't know anything about his life. He was remembered for his message, a message of how all humanity tends to walk in pride and hurt others with our thoughts and actions. So let me close with this thought. Let's go back to the beginning. Obadiah's name means servant of Yahweh or worshiper. But let's hone in on servant. My challenge after hearing this and studying this and speaking this is that this week we will reflect honestly on how well we are not only being a follower of Christ, but how well are we a servant of Christ? What does being a servant of Jesus look like in our lives personally, or even as a church? How are we to humble ourselves even more before Christ and be an extension of his hands and feet? There's an old school song. I tried to play it today. I was like, I can't pass it. It's like so old school. But here's the words. Make me a servant, humble and meek. Lord, let me lift up those who are weak. And may the prayers of my heart always be, make me a servant. Make me a servant today. Are we a servant of ourselves and our own emotions? Or are we a servant of Jesus? That's my challenge for us to think about and pray about and use that information and to lead to transformation this week.